might ask, when does utang na loob or debt of gratitude ever gets repaid? Many children of immigrants feel the burden not just to pay but to overpay, a debt they are grateful for but never asked for in the first place. In today's episode, let's explore utang na loob. Is it really meant to be fully repaid? Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak and love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Rowan, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first-generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kaping barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care, and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. By the way, this podcast is brought to you by the masterclass called Pakiramdam, Attunement Filipinos on Affection Beyond Words. In this masterclass, discover how you can begin to pivot meanings you've placed on Filipino affection, transforming your relationship with yourself and those you call mahal sa buhay or loved ones. You know, pakiramdam is the most complex of all the Filipino core values and the root of many cultural gaps in the Filipinx home. So please check out the show notes for instant access. Here I talk about the unique ways that Filipinos seek and express affection. Hi everyone! Welcome to the Speak the Pinoy Love Language podcast. Rowan here, your host. I was just sowing some seeds outside. It's spring as I am recording this episode. I love spring because prior to that, winter, talking about just plants and garden, it almost seemed like things have died. But spring reminds us that even in the dead of winter, things can continue to blossom again. So let's begin our episode today. What's the definition of, like I mentioned, there is the debt of gratitude. I've also heard people say debt of the soul. What other language do you use to describe utang na loob? Now, utang na loob is when someone does a favor for you. Usually, you might have asked for it, especially during times of need. For example, if you're new in America and you have a sister who's professional, let's say a teacher back home, and you have a friend, a Filipino friend who's a principal, and because you hope that your sister will not have a hard time looking for her first job, you might phone the principal and say, pare, or like friend, right? You know, could you help out my sister? Is there any space there for her? And, you know, of course, there is no guarantee if the principal was able to help the sister. A sister lands a position, or at least the principal tries his dear best to make that happen. There is an utang na loob. There is this debt that really could not be repaid via monetary way. So another example is simply borrowing money knowing that the person, or loaning money I should say, knowing that the other person could not ever repay it. Usually this happens in the Philippines because there is that hierarchy. As you know, we have this almost like an unspoken case system. We have the class A to E, E being the poorest of the poor, people in the what they call quote and unquote squatters area. And then the A again is, I know I've shared this in the other episode, people are really affluent, rich, they might have multiple homes in the best villages, and basically they can afford. And just for the purpose of a simpler example, if someone borrows money, let's say a laborer that works for the affluent or the boss, if he borrows money because maybe a child is sick, the amo, the boss, might loan him money. The amo might loan him money. But sometimes, especially during crisis, the person in that hierarchy may not expect a monetary exchange, especially if the person ranks lower in that hierarchy. And then the exchange would be utang na loob. So it could be an exchange in kind. And actually, when we say utang without the loob, usually it's a quantifiable amount. I know that I made the example of the money, but there's a distinction there as far as hierarchy. But if you're borrowing someone from a friend or closer in that hierarchy, usually there is an agreement that you are to repay that utang. So the word repay, as it relates to utang, is more like it's a quantifiable amount. So if you borrow 100 pesos, you have to repay basically your utang. Without the word loob, it's usually a specific and quantifiable amount, currency, money borrowed. So let's differentiate again with just the utang. Like I said, is difficult to quantify. Usually there is this disparity when it comes to hierarchy, and the one giving the favor may know that their efforts or favor given would not be exchanged in the same way. So the main difference of utang na loob and utang is quantifiable and utang na loob is not. Now, the difficult part of utang na loob, especially during migration. So I'll go now to immigration. Because I'm also an immigrant, I've shared with you my story. If you haven't listened to the earlier episode, how I am an immigrant twice. I was initially a 1.5 Filipino-American generation wave, belonging to that generation wave. But then something happened and then I came back again when I was 23 as an adult, as a first-generation Filipino immigrant. And really, I could understand what they say about losing so that you may gain. And when Filipino parents talk about the narrative of what they expect from their children, it usually is they're trying to really remind them of what they have to forget or what they would have to have lost to gain. Now, I want to make sure as you're listening to this, if you're a second generation onwards, it's really not your burden. But I want to explain the narrative, the underlying need of most Filipino immigrant without even them knowing consciously why they're doing it. I remember leaving for the last time when I was 23. That's the second time I became an immigrant. And it was bittersweet. I knew that America is this place of the land of the greener pasture. But because I was born and raised in the Philippines, everything over there was familiar. I have my barkada, all my childhood friends, everything that is familiar to me, food, anything that's comforting for me, all my emotional resources, my support are all there. When I packed my suitcase, and during the time that I have to haul my suitcase, because my mom was like, come on, we don't want to run late for our flight. It was very sad. I remember looking at every corner of my childhood home and knowing that it would take some time before I come home again, and not even knowing when. And so with a lot of really a nudge from my mom, who's a very practical superwoman, she's like, just try it and see how things go. And even with me saying that, I acknowledge that that's such a privilege to have that type of option. But quite frankly, when I landed in America, I didn't think that that was an option. I felt like it was just the option was to succeed. Imagine having to leave my roots, to forget a lot of things, to transplant, leaving all my emotional resources, my support groups, to establish a new life in America. So I'm sharing this because the utang na loob that perhaps many Filipino Americans feel is based from that feeling of loss and grief even. Now, if you're a parent listening to this, especially if you are a first-generation immigrant, it really is our job to find outlet, to find emotional resources again, so that we don't put on that burden, even if it's unconscious, to our children. Indeed, it's not their place to return the favor. And I think when we talk to many Filipino-American immigrant parents, I've done this in a lot of family therapy. They are actually quite surprised that they've burdened their children a lot. And they feel bad. And that's the thing when we don't work on, or we're so busy, honestly, as an immigrant trying to make ends meet. And it's I talked about this in the masterclass called Pakiramdam. So check out the show notes. It's all there. How in the Philippines we co-regulate. And that means we lean on others to help us calm down, to help us soothe ourselves. That's missing when we immigrate. In America, because it's a very individualistic society, the focus is on self-regulation. So you see that everywhere when you even go on social media, that, it's all about self-care, yoga, meditation. All those are wonderful things and should be part of our arsenal. We should all have that. But the Filipino immigrant is not used to that. Not that they're not capable or don't have those tools, but they're not honed. What is honed is the co-regulation, seeking others for comfort. That really works out in the Philippines. And I could talk about that in more detail at a later episode. So this feeling also of loss, again, of grief, of being uprooted, and feeling sometimes of being demoted, right? I've had many clients, immigrants who are professional back home, but before they can be seen in the same level of professionalism, here in America, they have to work odd jobs like clean toilets, and because they need to build up their credit, their references. So the feeling of like demotion. And then if your glass is so empty and you have children and you're expected to pour, because that's the role of a parent, love and affection, attention to your children, but your glass is just so empty, I think you could imagine how we very maladaptively, meaning in an unhealthy way, would solicit that type of interaction from our children, almost as if they're adults that we want to be poured water into. And so if you're a parent, the key to that is really self-awareness. Also, knowing that we're very collective and it's okay. Co-regulation, it's a wonderful thing. There is a distinction between codependency. And like I said, we'll focus on that on another episode. So again, parents may use stories or pass on negative imprints of their immigration story. Now, it's actually really wonderful if a parent is quite aware, self-regulated, and they have outlets that they share their story, because that's part of passing culture to the next generation. It's the way we share it and the intention on why we need to share it. So be aware of those things, how we share it and our intention. And if we're running on an empty tank, That's when we hold off and not share those types of things. That's when it becomes a story of burden to our children. So again, now, there is this word called pahiwatig. Again, if you're interested in the masterclass called Pakiram, I also talked about pahiwatig in this masterclass. But just a simple definition, pahiwatig is subtle cues to directly solicit attention or even affection, but in a covert way. For example, under pahiwatig is a lot of approaches, one of which is called parinig. This is when you voice out or you're talking about a person that's within earshot, but you're actually talking to someone else. But you're hoping the person can hear you. So that's the pahiwatig of parinig. So usually, immigrants might use that because their feelings are hurt. They want to be coaxed or comforted by the other person without them directly telling the other person. And so they might do a parinig. And usually, the response would be, "Ako bang pinag-uusapan ninyo?" So someone would say, "Are you talking about me?" So that's the subtle art of pahiwatig, right? In the Philippines, children are taught to respond a certain way. There's a lot of rehearsal that happens. And so if you're a Filipino-American, my advice is to give yourself grace, because these things, these subtle nonverbal cues that I often speak about and will speak about more, these skills are honed. And I talked about in the masterclass how there is a lot of rehearsing for a child. There's a lot of even actually second generation Americans, you'll hear them say, "Sinong mas mahal mo, si mommy or si daddy? Who do you love more, mommy or daddy?" There's also, maybe you're not familiar with this in America, but this is very common in the Philippines, where a young baby or a toddler is going to have this rehearsal. The mom or an auntie pretend she's leaving and would watch the reaction of the child. And when the child is really upset, usually she shows up. It's like bulaga, it's like a peekaboo game, but it's actually not a fun game for the baby. But she does this over and over again. So there's a lot of that rehearsal. So when I talk about rehearsal, I'm talking about those things. There's a lot of other things that the parent-child caregiver dyad does to rehearse the child. There's a lot of also practicing through stories of hypothetical. A mother might say, "Nako, pag matanda na ako, baka itatapon mo na lang ako sa basura. Nako, if I am old and gray, you'll probably just throw me out in the garbage." In which the child, because the narrative and the rehearsal is all about how the child would respond, the child would usually respond, "Nako, mommy, hindi naman, bakit ko naman gagawin yun? Well, like, why would I do that?" And so usually parents share that out of, first of all, the Philippines is not an industrialized country. There are not systems in place for like older people. It's still very disorganized. And usually the back and forth, we rely within our own family system or outside the family system. We have what we call NGOs. There are non-government organizations. Because our government is disorganized, the systems are not in place yet. Hopefully that would change. So let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll talk about the word associated with utang na loob, which is not to repay in our native language. Diyan ka lang! If you think someone else would benefit from listening to this podcast, or specifically this episode, please share. Sharing is caring. Information is meant to be shared in communal spaces, especially those that are meant to connect and to encourage healing. Again, this episode is brought to you by the masterclass called Pakiramdam, Attunement, Filipinos on Affection Beyond Words, Don't forget to check out the show notes. Glad you're back. Like I already mentioned, first of all, it's wonderful to share with our children our immigration story, but not really to burden our children. I hope that's not the intent, but to help them loop back to their roots. There are studies that the more we know about our culture, the more that we can make sense of our story, the more healthier we are as far as the way we perceive ourselves. And that truly makes sense. Before I go to the words other than what we use to describe utang na loob in our native language, for just parents listening, I think parents 99% want the best for their children. And I have mentioned to make sure find your own support group or learn also to self-regulate. I call this stroke and kick. This happens a lot, and I hear a lot of younger Filipino Americans in my practice where they don't feel enough and they're doing the best that they can. They feel like they are a failure. And they hear their parents say, it's fine, anak, you can do whatever you want. It's fine. So I call that the stroke. But the kick is when, so it's the stroke and the kick is usually the statements that sticks to us. It's when we utter statements under our breath. Nako, kung naging doktor ka lang, right? So even if we've heard, it's fine, do what you want to do, but when our parents utter statements under their breath, that sticks to us. It almost feels like that's what they're actually thinking. So it's called the stroke and the kick. So if you're a parent, be consistent. Have a kumare, a friend who could be an outlet so that you're not using your children as that type of sounding board. And I understand we want the best for our children, but you must trust your own parenting that once you've given them all the tools that they need, that they might not choose the best or what you want for them, but they would eventually choose what's the best for them. Now, let's go back. Now, there's a word in the Philippines for utang na loob. So when you say repay, bayaran, it's more like the quantifiable. Bayaran, pay it. And I think in many ways, utang, when you translate that in English, it's like repay. So, bayaran mong utang na loob mo. And that's how it sounds like for the Filipino American. But the word that we really use in Filipino lexicon is not bayaran, but tanaw. T-A-N-A-W is to glimpse back. Tanaw, to not be forgotten, basically. And so, that's really the need for the parent who has forgotten a lot of things not to be forgotten by their Filipino American children is very strong. I see this a lot in when I do family therapy. Underlying is the need to really be seen, even though they're the adult and it's not fully the responsibility of the child. So one maybe recommendation, if you have a good enough relationship with your parent, is repetition. When the parent is trying to rehearse, simply allow them to say it. Nako, pag matanda na ako, or when I'm old, this is gonna happen. They simply want an appeasing statement. Hindi naman, that's not gonna happen. If you feel that's what's gonna happen, obviously you want to be honest with yourself. And so it's that rehearsal. It's wanted to be pacified, wanting to anchor that they would not be left alone, they would not be forgotten. Now, I want you again to stress that you're a Filipino American listening to this episode. It's not your fault. In fact, no one's to blame. In the dyad of a parent and the child, the parent is responsible for the child. And so again, I probably repeated this a couple of times, is for the parent to be self-aware of their own space, learn the intention, and be mindful of their approach when they're sharing the narrative to their children. Without knowing, we might be burdening our children. In the Philippines, when parents repeat over and over again, we have many rehearsal, and we know to just pacify the parent, and we just throw out statements like, it's fine, we'll be okay, don't worry about it. The Filipino race in the Philippines seems to be fine with that. In America, it's like, because you're using indirect language, you're basically trying to point to a hill, the tip of a hill, while describing or what's around the hill. It's very difficult to understand, especially for those born and raised in America. And so today, I hope I've given some light about Utang na Loob. And if I may recap, I think the most important points to remember is the need to not be forgotten, the feeling of loss and grief, to gain more in immigration. Also, it's not the fault of the Filipino American not to be able to read the subtle cues, but to also know there is that skill in the Philippines that our immigrant parents are expecting our children to be able to read. The good news is it could be learned just enough. And that's the purpose, one of the purpose of this podcast, really bridging that cultural gap. Also, that Utang na Loob is, there's different kinds. The Utang na Loob is described more tanaw. Tanawin mo ang utang na loob mo, which is you're grateful for it, you're not gonna forget it, and the person that have given you favor is not forgotten. So, thank you so much for listening, for having me in your ear today. Always an honor. If you have any questions, drop me an email. And better yet, if you find this episode helpful, please leave me a stellar 5-star review so that more people can find us. Maraming salamat at sa uulitin!